All right, so the resource I want to build is an exchange-based resource for new sweep rules. So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to go to Visual Studio. I'm going to find that generic resource name folder that was created when I copied the dev package, and I'm just going to go and rename this. So MSFT has to be the prefix for this project because it's Microsoft Exchange in our case. So we're going to go EXO, which is the prefix for the Exchange workload, and I'm going to go and do sweep rule. So I've renamed my folder and moved in the R key. I find it here. Now I'm going to have to do the same exercise for the other files, right? So basically here, let me do EXO sweep rule. I'm just going to copy this. Then I'll do the same thing for the schema.mod file. Rename this here. And then off we go. Perfect. Now I'm going to open the PSM1 file, which contains the logic for my resource. And I'm going to take a look at the list of to-dos I have to do. The first thing it says is replace this here by the primary key. When I look at the documentation, I see that the new sweep rule commandlet has a name parameter, which I'm going to be using as my primary key. So let's go back to my file. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to replace this by my name property, right? So I'm basically flagging this as a primary key by making it mandatory. The other thing I'm going to do is go back to this article and identify all the other parameters. You see there are a bunch of them here, but we need to be very careful in the case of Exchange. This also applies to other workload, but for example, when I take a look at, all right, so you know what, the confirm we can skip. This is PowerShell related. Destination folder, something I'll need. If you take a look at domain controller, the definition states that this is not available in the cloud version. It's only on premises. Therefore, it's out of scope for my resource. We only build resources for Microsoft 365. Okay, so you need to be careful about this. Other workloads will have parameters that will clearly specify this is reserved for internal use, which means you're not allowed to go and change it, even though the commandlet kind of exposes it as a parameter. It's not going to have any effect if you do this. So make sure you only capture the ones that make sense to you. Some of them will be of type Boolean, some of them could be of type integer, like how many days you want to keep it, and so on. So I've done the exercise beforehand, and I went and I basically created the full list of parameters I want for my resource. I'm just going to make sure that the alignment is good. And there I have it. So I have now my list of parameters for my get function. However, I now need to go and you can see that I've actually made some mistakes here where I actually forgot to define those as parameters. All right, we're good now. I'm going to go and copy all of this here. And I also need to do the same exercise for the other functions. So the set target resource also needs this full list of parameters and the test. So I'm going to do this here. All right, so I tackled a few to-dos in one go. The export function doesn't need the parameters. The only thing it needs is the authentication parameters to be able to connect and do a list operation. Okay, so let's go back to our get function. Now, you see the next to-do is to go and replace the primary key when we're trying to select from the exported instances. We don't need to get into the details here. Essentially, since we've made name our primary key, that's how we're going to go about it. Can remove the to-do mentioned here. Now, they're saying, all right, go and replace the get commandlet by the one that will allow you to retrieve a specific instance. In my case here, if I go to the documentation and take a look at the get sweep rule, I can see that one option is to retrieve by mailbox, which is what I'm going to use since we don't have identity defined as a parameter, right? Because we're trying to keep the resource as generic as possible so that we can take one configuration and apply it onto multiple tenants. Whereas if we were to use identity, that identity is specific to this tenant on which the rule was created. So what I'll do is I'm going to go and replace the get commandlet by get sweep rule. And then here, I'm going to go and retrieve by mailbox and pass in the mailbox property. Okay. The next thing to do is to complete the hash table that will get returned. So what I've done is I've actually gone and define all the properties here. I'm just going to paste this and do the alignment. right? You need to be careful when retrieving the values. There are a few things that could go wrong in the sense that sometimes the parameters are not named the same for the get and the new commandlet. So for example, if you take a look at mailbox, this is how we name the property in the resource. However, the get function returns this as mailbox owner ID. So when you look at documentation, you can see that the new sweep rule had this defined as mailbox, but when it gets returned, it's now named mailbox owner ID. So just be careful about this. It's not always a one-to-one match between what's returned by the commandlet and what you have there. Same goes for the sender, right? So sender right now, if you take a look at how it returns it, it's actually returning it in this form of double quotes and then the SMTP address of the user. All we care about is this piece here because, again, when looking at the documentation, this is how we're passing it to the set function or the new function in this case. Okay, so just be careful. So what I'm doing here is I'm basically just keeping everything that's inside the double quote. Another thing that was missed as far as the get function is the connection. So essentially what we need to do is replace the workload by the name of the workload we're connecting to. In my case, this is an Exchange Online resource. So this will offload the call to another module which handles all the authentication for Microsoft 365 DSC. Let's then move on to the set function. Okay, so if we look at the to-dos, we see that we have three things to address in this resource. Now, the pattern for the set target resource function is always going to be the same thing. If the resource is specified to be present, so the user in the config set the ensure property to present, meaning it needs to exist, but the current instance is set to absent, meaning it's not there. That means we need to go and create it. So what we'll do is we'll need to call into the new sweep rule. Okay. The set parameters here is basically the properties that have been passed, and then we've removed all the authentication components such as the credentials, the ensure parameters, and so on. Okay. Now let's look at the second case here. Second case is where the user specified that the rule needs to be present, and the current instance is already present. Okay. So that means that it exists and it should exist. The reason why we got called into the set target resource is because something had a discrepancy, right? If we look at the create scenario, for example, the discrepancy was that we said it should be present and it was absent. In this case here, the discrepancy is not on the ensure property. It means it's on something else, right? There's another property somewhere that drifted. So what we need to do is go and actually change this to the sweep rule. So now what I'll do is I'll just make sure that it's a set sweep rule. There it is. Perfect. So we're good. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go and do set sweep rule in this case here. Excellent. And then the last scenario is when the user said, I don't want that sweep rule to exist, but it currently exists. So that means we need to go and remove it. So again, I'm just going to go and check, make sure that I have a remove or delete sweep rule. Remove sweep rule. Perfect. So that's what I'm going to be calling into. Good. We're done for the set function. Now let's move down to the test. Test doesn't require you to change anything. Right? This is very generic. All it does is receive the parameters that were specified by the user, retrieve the parameters of the current instance from the get function, and evaluates them all. If you want to do some additional logic in there, you can. However, I would recommend you leave this function untouched for the resources you are developing. The last thing we need to address is the export target resource function. This one's a little different than the others, where it is not required by DSC per se, but it is a requirement of Microsoft 365 DSC to add it. The export function essentially loops through all instances of the resource across the environment and then retrieves the parameters associated with each one from the get function. Again, the signature doesn't need to change for the export. We're only passing in authentication parameters. The first to do we have is just like we had to do for the get function, is replace the workload. So in my case, again, this is an Exchange Online resource. So I'm just going to specify the workload here. And then if we move down, I see that I need to retrieve or replace the cmdlet by cmdlet's retrieve all instances. So in my case here, I'm going to go and do get sweep rule. There's actually a bit more complicated here because the sweep rules are getting retrieved by mailboxes. So what I'll have to do is I'll actually have to go and get all the mailboxes in the environment and then loop through that get sweep rule. I'm just going to spare this for the purpose of the exercise. I'm just going to go with get sweep rule. So assume that this here would return all the sweep rules in the environment. Now, what it's doing is going and looping through all the exported resources, and it's going to call into the get target to retrieve all the parameters. So what we need to do here is specify the primary key so that the get target resource can go and retrieve the actual instance. I'm going to go and do name, and then it will be so this is the config, right? So the instance dot name. This will go retrieve all the parameters, and the rest we can leave as default. It will go and it will simply just compile all the retrieve properties into a DSC file.